Okay, it looks like we are just about at starting time. So today we are going to be going through and looking at the System Command Line library. We've got John once again, who has been one of the, I'll say, principal devs on the project, building this out. We're going to be looking at the sort of a dependent NuGet package that's part of the same repository called System.CommandLine.Rendering. It's sort of designed to go through and make outputting your CLI apps much easier. So things like if you want to do some fancy layout with a grid or have automatic updating similar to what you'd get in a WPF framework with like a binding. So that type of functionality only built into the CLI. So John, I don't know if you want to give a brief introduction to yourself and then we can dive into the library. Give me just one moment because I do have to unmute you and figure out where the heck your audio source went. Okay. There you go. Now you're hot.
Great. Cool. So yeah, I'm a developer at the .NET team. Been working on the System Command Line thing for a bit over a year, and then a little bit farther back, this was the new parser for the .NET CLI, which we kind of at some point said, it would be great to have some libraries that people can use for some of these broader ambitions that go beyond parsing that we have, and completions and an app model that involves a sort of an execution pipeline. And, these were some of the things that we sort of expanded beyond what is typically available in a lot of libraries. And then the thing that we discovered from there was that rendering output was actually a place where the older System.console APIs were not really as rich as we might like, especially given that the new Windows terminal has come out. ANSI terminals have become, they've been available on Windows for a little while, but you have to do something special to enable it. There's a Windows 32 API that you have to use to enable virtual terminal mode. So what does ANSI output give you? What are the different kinds of things you can render to the console? These are all things that we looked at and said, this is really hard for people to do well. And maybe we should try and tackle some of that complexity and provide an API for doing it. So that's the piece that it's a little bit less far along than the core System Command Line library that offers parsing, indication, and all the model binding things. But we think that there's like a really interesting story here. And so, at some point, I somehow convinced Kevin that he should become interested in this thing. You can see his name here even in the source code.
You can't see it now. Your camera is what's being shown, not your screen. But
I see. So yeah, this has been a collaborative effort, but Kevin, you've been particularly involved in every stage of it. It's been open source almost from the beginning. This isn't really, the whole thing is very community driven. It's not being driven by a Microsoft top-down kind of effort. This has really been very grassroots.
And it's been fun to hack on and work on. So I'm going to, as much as I enjoy looking at your webcam, I'm going to flip you over here to your screen.
Cool.
Okay, and we are up. We've got your Visual Studio and then a terminal on the right-hand side.
Yep.
With a fancy little clock. Tiny itty-bitty font, but fancy little clock.
It's pretty fancy. I don't have the new Windows terminal installed on this machine, or else I could zoom this thing with the scroll wheel, but I can't. We can take a look at it and let me do this in Visual Studio Code, which has a scalable terminal. So in the System Command Line GitHub repo, we have this samples directory, and inside of the samples directory, there's a few things here. One of them is this rendering playground, and that's the thing that I was just showing the clock for. So we can show that here too. Go over to here and grab this somewhat cryptic command line. Oh, I know what happened there.
Hey, John?
Yeah.
Do you mind shifting your window up just a hair? I think the very bottom of where you're typing is getting clipped.
Got it. Is that better?
That is perfect.
Cool. And the font's a little bit more agreeable?
Font is more agreeable. Thank you.
Interesting. Let's capture both. Oh, I see. I can do that. Okay, so what are we looking at? There were a couple of things that we saw that were common things people like to do with richer console apps, which are things like table layouts, other kinds of multi-column layouts, potentially, or different screen regions that kind of show different things, and then within that sometimes is things that are updating. It might be progress bars, or it might be data that's updating within specific cells, and those are, they're great experiences from a console perspective. They're pretty hard to write, given that the standard console APIs are just standard in, standard error, standard out. So you're just writing text, and that text. So System.console has in a normal terminal, right? You might have a virtual terminal that's sitting on top of those console streams and is able to render things in a way where you are able to see history, right? If I go, I'm going to do the same thing over here, just to give you an example of, if I think of it just as a file stream. Let's see if this works. Right. Yep. Okay.
Okay. Perfect. I think we got that fixed. Sorry, doing this a little bit on the fly.
Okay.
Cool. So you may want to go back to where you were kicking off this new terminal. I think that bit got clipped out while I was shifting windows around.
Sure. Let me just explain what's going on the screen right here, and talk a little bit about terminals versus consoles.
Mm-hmm.
So System.console conflates two things that are usually separate concepts in command line applications, being the console versus the terminal. So what is the difference between these two things, right? And a lot of people use the terms interchangeably, which can be a little bit confusing. The console is just a set of streams, right? And this idea goes back to, it's effectively, it goes back to actual hardware before it was a software abstraction, right? It was what is the input and output from a physical console, right? And there was an additional output stream, which is known as standard error. So you can output on standard out or on standard error. You can input on standard in. These are typically, going way back, these were connected to actual physical devices. And that physical device was a terminal and a keyboard, right? So the console concept, when you have a terminal sitting on top of it, the original terminal that sits on top of the console was a typewriter, right, or a printer. And so the output for that printer is, there's no way to go back and rewrite it. It's just spooling out in front of you. So What you're seeing on the right here is I'm thinking about the text stream and writing out the text stream in a way that's append only. Right? And that's really the true console interface that you get when you spin up a process and you connect to its standard in and standard out, standard error. Right? It's up to you as the consumer of those streams to think about history if you want to. So at some point, the virtual terminal concept came along, and it's a fairly universal concept at this point. The virtual terminal is able to do things, and what the Windows command line really, commos.exe, what this thing really is it is a virtual terminal, but it doesn't follow a common virtual terminal standard that's been used in the Xterm world on Linux and Mac for many, many years. And one of the things that we said here was, as a foundation for this approach, we said, let's actually separate the console and terminal abstractions from one another. Right, so on the right, we're just writing output to a stream, and we're just letting it render to the terminal, right? And the terminal has this, it shows you all this past stuff that was in the stream, and depending on the settings in my terminal window, I can scroll back a certain distance, but maybe not forever.
All right, the terminal or the console has a fixed buffer.
Yep. Yeah, and so that's an implementation. Like I can go and I can adjust the buffer size, right? So that's just an implementation detail of my virtual terminal application. It's not intrinsic to the console itself, right? It's not intrinsic to the application that I'm talking to right now, whose standard out I'm seeing being rendered.
Right.
Okay. So on the left, we're doing something a little bit different, right? We're overwriting sections of the screen over and over again to produce more of an animation in place rather than a continuously rolling output stream. But the way that we're doing that is actually to produce a continuously rolling output stream, because remember, that's what the console is. And just as an example here, let's go and look at the console abstraction. So this is in System.CommandLine, and we have this iConsole, and it has standard out, standard error, and standard in. It doesn't have things that let you, do terminal stuff, like repositioning the cursor and making fonts different colors and things like this. That's not part of this abstraction. They have a different abstraction for that called iTerminal. And this is what iTerminal looks like right now, but it's very much a work in progress. Right? So you can see that both of these things are present in System.console, but they're conflated in System.console. If I go to System.console and I redirect my output to a file and then I try to set the foreground color, I get an exception. Right? So that kind of tells you that there's too many different responsibilities in System.console's interface. Plus it's global. So you have state sharing problems, which makes testing it. If you've ever tried to write tests for things that need to write against System.console, you probably quickly found that they couldn't be run in parallel, and if one of them failed and didn't clean up correctly, all the others would fail, and things like that.
Right.
So these abstractions here are kind of a work in progress, and I think we'll probably end up in a different place for the stream readers and stream writers compared to what we have right now, where we're using stream abstractions. We didn't go with System.io.stream for various reasons. One of them is that you can send it to objects. You can just write any object. It has all these interfaces, overloads for write that let you pass in any object to it, right? Which is, again, it's a little bit of not the right abstraction. But as you'll see with System.CommandLine.Rendering, we actually do want to be able to render objects, but we want to control the way they get written to output. Right? So it's not that interface's problem to think about that. So this is some of the reasons why we defined a new console interface and a new terminal interface. So hopefully that all makes reasonable sense.
Makes sense to me, but I've also been in the project working on it, so.
Yeah. So let me show a different thing here. Let's do. Does this work? No. Oh, because that thinks that's a switch. Sorry. Try this. Yeah, look at that.
Huzzah! Diagonal lines of gibberish. I love it.
Yeah. What the heck is going on there?
So VT100 control characters, just off the top
Yeah,
of my head.
exactly. Um,
Really feels like something that should be turned into a screensaver.
yeah, we can do that. So what you're seeing there is that, even when I'm using VT100 output rather than just plain text output, right? Before it was just plain text output and you're seeing the time being appended again and again and again. That's what you're seeing here too, except it's also got all these control characters in the middle of it. So if we scroll back through it, we'll see the time here. Right? But it's embedded in all these control characters. What those control characters are doing is updating sections of the screen so that you get that effect that you saw in Visual Studio Code's terminal window here. Right? That is literally the same output, except on the right, we've set the terminal to virtual terminal mode using this Win32 API that I mentioned before. And we'll also detect terminal modes correctly on Linux and Mac because VT100 is just supported automatically on external terminals. Yeah, and you get this instead. Right? So this is, what VT100 is doing is it's sending signals over the standard output or standard error, right, and can be used on standard in as well and enabled separately on standard in. It's sending signals that say, hey, move the cursor, hey, set this color. All these kinds of things are encoded into the VT100, but it's still just a text stream, so you need to have a virtual terminal that knows how to render this stuff correctly. And the upcoming Windows terminal does that automatically as well. The future is VT100, even though this is a technology that is 40 years old.
Right. So real quick, there is a question here. Xavier, I thought you said last time there can only be one directive, but you used two this time. So you want to go back to that invocation and look at that real quick?
Yeah, yep. So I'll do that here because it's a little easier to read. So here's what I did to enable the clock with the in-place re-rendering.
Shift it all the way to the left. Remember, my video sits in the bottom right corner, so anything in the bottom right gets cut off.
I've got the stream on my other machine over here, so
perfect.
I can kind of see it and position accordingly. Technology. Okay. So Xavier, your question is, you thought that you can only use one directive. That's not true. You can only have directives at the beginning of the command line. So, right, this is .NET Run. This little thing here says everything after it should be sent to my program. So all these are all of the arguments that are being sent to the rendering playground program. There can be as many directives as you want. It's just that once you stop having directives at the front of the command line, everything else becomes the options that are defined inside of your program itself. So we had talked about Dragonfruit before. The rendering playground program CS is a Dragonfruit program, right? So it has, rather than the string args for main, it has a bunch of strongly typed named specific arguments. So this is the thing that defines the input to the program. Directives are always orthogonal to this. So directives are tend to drive cross-cutting functionality, and a lot of it is functionality that's just built into System Command Line. So what these two are doing, ultimately the story is that you want to be able to specify them, but in most cases you want them to just have reasonable defaults, which we call, detect. Basically, we're talking about detecting terminal capabilities and just doing the right thing. So that on Windows we'll say, oh, can we elevate it to VT100? Yes, then we can render in VT100 mode. If not, we run against the System.console APIs, which do work for a lot of terminal type of stuff. They're not remotable in the same way that VT100 is, right? If you send a VT100 stream across an SSH connection, it still renders correctly on the remote terminal, which is one of the reasons why it's really nice. System.console is not very good at that kind of thing. Or if you are starting up a child process and your parent process is redirecting output and you want the child process to not emit stuff like VT100 into your log file, right? Then the directives become handy for telling it, hey, here's the rendering mode I want. So that's kind of what you're seeing here, is like the ability to specify, but hopefully also you don't need to if you're not in one of these kind of hybrid scenarios. So what this directive is enabling VT, but if you don't specify it, we try to detect it. What this one is here is what's the output mode. There are 3 different output modes that we support. One's ANSI, which is the thing you see on the right with all the the VT100 codes, or also known as ANSI escape sequences. Non-ANSI, which means render as if you are writing to System Console, which basically means plain text, but we also will try to position the cursor using System.Console APIs. And the third option is file, which no attempt is made to reposition cursors ever. We say, okay, we're just writing to a file. But you can force VT100 to the file, for example. So using these two directives together, you can have various combinations of output. So given all that stuff, what we wanted to then do is say, okay, we've got the capabilities to take a single block of code and render it in all these different ways. So what does that code look like, right? What's the API that we could write? And we thought about ASP.NET MVC views, and we thought a bit about WPF, and what are the view abstractions there that kind of let you think about layouts and content first and foremost, rather than text streams, right? And then we can use that API to target all of these different kinds of output. So let's take a look at the clock. How does this thing work?
By magic.
Do you want to explain this one, Kevin? I think you've got more context in the API details than I do.
Well, I will do my best, and you can correct me where I steer awry. So I have done a bunch of work on these things. So inside of the system rendering project, there's starting at the top, the highest level object is views. For people who are familiar with like thick client, like XAML types setup, you can think of these as roughly equivalent to like the various elements that you might lay out. People who have done WinForms or Windows Forms might also be familiar with this type of setup. At the top level, we have a screen view, and the screen view is somewhat misleading in its name, but it basically represents the view of your terminal that's visible. So from like a system console API perspective, you can think of this as the actual height and width that you have available. With this clock perspective, inside of the views, most things boil down into one of two types. You've got sort of your layout views for if you want to do things like tables or grids or that kind of thing, and you can compose those things together however you want. And then inside of those layout views, you usually get down to a content view whose purpose is really just to output some sort of content. If you dig a little deeper in the API inside of the content view, there's things called spans, similar to what you might be familiar with like HTML for a span object for being able to, say, adjust the color of something so that part of your text is red, for example. And so in this example, what we have here is a screen view at the root. And inside of the screen view, we're going to put a content view, which is just that clock that you see there. And then we're going to start rendering it. The while loop at the bottom is just there looking for a key press to indicate basically stop the demo. And after that, it's just going to sit there and spin, and every time the clock has changed, it's just going to update that observable. So not to dive too deep into the iObservable interface, but it basically has a publish subscribe type pattern to it. For people with MVVM backgrounds, you can think of it almost as the equivalent of like an iNotify property changed. Please no one throw stuff at me. I realize they are very different in a lot of fundamental ways. But that content view from observable registers up looking for changes to that observable object, and then will automatically update the UI contents as those change, which is how you're seeing that clock essentially tick every time there's a new second. So that's a very long explanation for a very few lines of code. But ultimately it leads to a ticking clock, like what you see right there.
Another thing that I would add in as a sort of a demonstration of a different set of capabilities that you alluded to just then is this. I don't know if we added directives for height and width and so on. And there may be some collisions here between some of the concepts, but we have this other sample. And you had mentioned this sample here. Let me make sure this is positioned in a way that it will make sense when I render it. Okay, so we have this Moby sample, which is it's like the first paragraph of Moby Dick, with some formatting inside of it. And the rendering playground has height, top, left, width parameters you can pass in. All right, so you can see here some underlining, some text colors. The text colors are actually quite interesting because let's see. I don't know if we can zoom this. Yeah, there we go. And you'll see that word wrapping is supported within that area. Right, so even though I rendered to a, let's do something like that, let's see what it looks like.
Shrink it down to almost.
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
and I am aware, I was playing around with some of the rendering stuff earlier this week, and I did run into a couple bugs in different areas. So this, like John said at the beginning, this rendering stuff is very much in a lot more flux and not quite as stable as the base system command line parser that it's built on top of. So we definitely would enjoy feedback on issues, bug reports, or if people want to dive in and help and fix stuff. There's lots in here to fix.
Yep. But putting these two things together, you can imagine that once you have, if you define regions of your screen and think of them as a table layout, right? This API that I'm showing here can show you how you can create a bunch of different cells within it, and you can do the updating in place with the clock approach, and by combining those two things, get some really interesting, rich, animated status outputs. And that's like kind of one of our ideal goals for this piece.
Right. You want to jump back to that clock output, because there was one thing that we didn't quite touch on that I don't know if it's horribly intuitive. So in the clock output where we have it updating, if you want to just jump back to the code real quick, there was that content view from observable. So one day John comes to me and says, hey, I've got this great, cool, awesome idea of how to actually effectively do this binding, because we had tossed around different ideas. My WPF background, I'm very partial to the binding of I want to just update my data and have my view magically be pulled into sync. John, can you move it so we can see that full from observable line? 107, I think. There we go. So you'll notice that content view from observable, that second parameter that's going in there. So the first parameter is just any object that implements iObservable. And the second one goes into that X lambda and what looks like an interpolated string there. But this is kind of a obscure area of C# that got added when string interpolation came into play, in that $sign in front of the string doesn't always return a string. And so in this case, it's actually returning a formatable string, which you can sort of think about it as the equivalent of what a link expression is to a link query, where the link expression contains the metadata of the actual query, and the link query itself is just effectively the delegate. So this is a formatable string basically gives you all of the metadata about the string that could be formatted, so that you can then act on it and do something different, which is how we're getting our automatic updating. We're basically parsing out those elements and saying, I see that that's an observable object. Let me wire up to the appropriate events and then update my UI when those things come through. So you can actually, it's quite powerful in that if you wanted to say prefix the time with the time is or something, you could just type that string in there and it automatically works. And so it's smart enough to realize, and when it's parsing that string, to know, okay, here's where the iObservable goes, here's the content that needs to update, and do all of that updating in place. So just something to be aware of. So this content view from observable, I think, is probably one of the most powerful ways of being able to use this rendering library, just because of how easy it is to get a region effectively in your output that just automatically updates as things go through.
And here is another example of that same approach,
Mm-hmm.
which the Moby Dick output that we were showing before. This is the code for that. So you can look at that if you want as well. So there's the code. We'll go here. Get enough of this thing rendered at once. Yeah, so what's going on here?
I do think there looks like a bug there, because it seems like call me appears to be bold.
What appears to be bold? Ah, yeah.
Call me right at the beginning, whereas your bold on starts at the end of that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so like we said, there's bugs like this. It doesn't take too long playing with this rendering playground app to start to find some of the rough edges and bugs in this area.
Yeah, this was definitely, the goal of the rendering playground was to make it easier to really interact with this functionality and see what it's doing on the screen, which is really, I think, very helpful. There's another thing here. Yeah, so we have this kind of approach here, but then you can also, because it's all just strings, you could imagine extension methods that do the wrapping in the VT100. So what is this thing? Do you want to look at the output of this, or what's the VT100 output?
Sure. Yeah, if you just want to render that out real quick. That might be worth seeing. Because without fail, if you play around with some of this VT stuff, you will inevitably get yourself into the settings where you break. Oh, interesting. Well, I'd have to look at what those control characters are, but there's definitely...
So let's go do that. Let's go do that.
Yeah. 'Cause I'm seeing stuff before...
So I think the first one is to clear the screen.
Oh, that could be.
If we had a good VT parser, we could create a much better debugging experience here.
If anyone would like to write one or recommend one, please let us know.
The problem. Yeah, I'll let you know what I can do there. So the other thing we can do is we can search for it, right? We can go, okay, we've got this thing. Typically,
it's the question mark, square brace, and then the numeric is what's important. I think the semicolon is what precedes parameters.
Yep, I think so. Let's try that.
The nice part about VT100 is it's been around for so many decades that there's lots of documentation. It just usually shows up on web pages that look like they were created 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I'm curious as to why we're not finding this.
Well, this is the... Oh, I guess you were just doing straight text search on it. Oh, probably because you have in the ANSI control character class, I think the square brace is part of that starting.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually separate strings.
Oh, right, yep. So if we look at this, we've got 88 references to this class. We can find a place where we define these also. Yeah, ANSI control code. Nope, not that one.
Oh, so ANSI class is what we're looking for. I'm just looking where that says ANSI escape.
Where's that? We've got a class that has like
I
a
believe
whole.
yeah, the one right above it.
There we go.
That's them. And that's why we're not finding it when we search.
Yeah. Yep. So. Oops. Yeah. Let's go back to this. That's right here. So we said bold on was the first one, right? So we go to bold on. That's the first one we know of.
Right.
And that one, let's just re-render that.
So it's calling me. So bold on has got to be either that 1M or 4M guy right there. I'm guessing.
So yeah, what these are doing is they're just wrapping that. Let's see, where's this thing? Kind of oddly hard to navigate to the actual
Well, if I
anti-code.
remember right, the style span, there's a bit of a visitor pattern there where it then translates it into these ANSI codes because the
Yeah.
the span, because we don't know whether it's going to be written out with ANSI or not,
Yep.
there's different visitors when it's parsing that formatable string into it. So bold on 1M, so there it is.
So that's in the correct place, but this other thing over here seems to be.
Yeah, whatever 6 is seems to be confusing it.
I feel like we're not writing that because I couldn't find it, but maybe maybe it's in one of these things. So yeah, the thing that we can always do, of course, is we can search for it. So this escape character here, that's this bit, right? And we have this defined. We have a constant for this, so escape, right?
Yep. Which
That's
apparently in the VS Code terminal renders as a question mark. I think your other
yeah,
one it rendered it as a weird box for Unicode something or another.
yep. And there's all these different categories as well. You can find it in here. Rapid blink. How do you think that? The other thing is, it's sometimes possible for things like this to be. Let's see. I think we do. I think during render, we render something else to prepare the screen, right? We clear the screen.
Yeah, we do something like a clear region or. Hold on. Your clear segment was at the bottom. It could also be a move. Oh, that could be it. I'm looking at how like the move or the clear where it's parameterized after the square brace, so that 6 may be something else actually.
Mm.
So it's not in there. Look at the cursor one. I think it's the next one up. Scroll, shines.
Ah,
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's something like this.
here it is. It's moving. It's this move to location.
Ah, that got it. That's what it is, and that's why we couldn't search for it.
Yep.
The H should have been a dead giveaway.
Yeah. So the H is the one that's kind of interesting here. So yeah, it has these different parameters. You can get a flavor here for the API that we have, the low level API that we have for ANSI output, which is for the ones that take inputs, we've created functions for them and so on.
Right.
And here's another one for setting the RGB colors. One of the things that it was probably not super noticeable, but the RGB colors for the Mobi sample are specified. They're not just your standard sort of 16 console colors.
Right. And it is worth noting too that we have seen slight differences between the Windows and NIX terminals, which is really unfortunate. It's getting a lot better, especially with the new terminal stuff on the latest version of Windows 10. So if you're on like the insider previews of Windows, you're probably going to have a much better experience than if you're on, say, an old version of Windows 10. So just keep that in mind.
Yep. Yeah, and the new Windows terminal will standardize this even further.
Right, which will be excellent. Cool. Sweet.
What's next?
Well, I was gonna say, what do you want to go after? We could run down trying to fix one of these bugs. We could go through and do a demo of actually using this to build something, if we wanted to.
I'm happy either way.
Fix the bug, says Xavier. Okay, well let's continue down this path then and see if we can actually fix this demo so that it works the way we expect. So, real quick, can you run this one more time? I'm curious. Run it in your PowerShell terminal.
All right.
I don't know what the terminal technology is. I realize the terminal that's listed there is PowerShell.
Yep.
VS Code, but I am curious if we see a different behavior there.
So here's the output. VT100 output looks the same. Right? It starts with the positioning thing, and then the bold thing happens later.
Right.
So it looks correct. So now I'm going to enable VT. So this defaults to true, but I can also set it true if I want.
Ah, interesting. So the other thing that it could be that's also worth noting is we may not actually have a bug here per se, or at least the bug may not necessarily be with this demo. Because when you're doing the VT control character stuff, it's very possible that you can get your terminal into bad states or inconsistent states where if one app doesn't properly clean itself up, the next app running ends up picking up some of the formatting or whatever the leftover settings were that weren't properly undone. So it's very possible, especially if like one of these apps crashes mid-run, that it hasn't properly reset some of the state that it was in. So you end up with your terminal running. And you see this in a lot of different terminal apps that even do things with like colors. If they run into errors, a lot of times they don't necessarily undo, say, the foreground color that they set. And so then your terminal's stuck in a weird foreground color until you reset it.
Yep.
Which could have been the case that we have here, which might mean that there is no bug.
Well, let's try this. Let's close Visual Studio Code and reopen it. And try this again. Whoa.
And the thing...
Oh, right. So what I'm doing here, Arcade is the build system that we use at .NET. It does a lot of great stuff for us. It manages signed builds and multiple operating system tests and things like this. But because we're We're replacing a bunch of MS build targets with Arcade, which isn't always ideal on the local dev environment. Like it'll pull down a very specific version of the .NET SDK, for example, do a bunch of other stuff that maybe isn't what you want for just a quick inner loop as a dev. So we have this flag to disable it.
That is a very good flag to know about.
Yeah. My PowerShell windows, I always forget it's there because for PowerShell, like the standalone PowerShell, which uses a different profile than the PowerShell that's embedded in VS Code, I just have this set up in my profile, so it's always there. I guess I should do the same thing for
if we don't have this documented somewhere on like our README, we might consider adding that, because I can see that. I know we got bit by this. We've done a couple hackathons on this project.
Yeah.
And I think without fail, every single person in the hackathon has gotten bit by it. So there we are. So I'm going to guess that we ran something that left us in a bad state. And I don't remember. I probably have to go back over the stream to try and figure out what the heck the order was that we ran. That's the beauty of this stream, John. Now we can actually go back and rewatch the first 50 minutes to see what was the order of things that we ran in that window.
Oh yeah, I think you've identified the basic problem though. It's kind of hard to actually. We do have a hook in place that was a community contribution to allow you to hook your program such that when cancel is sent, you can block the cancel and run some cleanup code before shutting down.
Right. So please be good citizens and clean up any formatting or whatnot that you've set. For the most part, the rendering stuff in the system command line rendering does try to handle that as much for you as possible. So if you're laying out a bunch of views, it will go through and toggle it on and off. But something like this where you've got bold on, bold off, if you don't properly match those tags, there's nothing in there to verify that you've done that.
The other thing is like nesting tags doesn't always work, and that's kind of terminal specific. So there's also stuff like that is potentially.
Hold on, John. Oh, John, I think you may have just hit it. Look at that. Call Me Ishmael is now bolded again. I'm wondering, so speculative, don't know this for a fact, but note the size of the window that you're running. I'm wondering if what's happening is at the end of that output, it's got the bold on flag, it runs out of space and never outputs the bold off tag, so it leaves the terminal output bolded.
Maybe. This is something that you can actually see. If we go back to this window now and run this again, I took out the code that was underlining, and you can see here, it actually looks like it's bolded through call here as well. It's kind of hard to tell. Let me increase the size of this terminal a little bit.
So Xavier, the answer is bold working? Yes, I think. It's kind of hard. Kind of hard to tell.
Yeah, see, in this PowerShell window, I don't know if it's doing bold at all.
And this is one of those weird bits of the VT100 is the terminal that you're running. You can send the commands, and your terminal can say thank you very much and choose how much of the spec it's going to follow. I mean, it could even be font related too. Like if the output font doesn't support bold, it wouldn't matter what VT100 code you sent if the font that it goes to render doesn't actually support bold as well. But
yeah, exactly. There's a lot of variables here. That looks like it bolded, but it looks like it bolded the whole sentence.
Yes, it does.
As far as I can tell. Let's try it with something that's more obvious. Because it does look like there's some kind of issue there.
Yeah, and I do wonder, do you have any more bold? It's interesting that because we only have that one bold style in this thing.
Yeah. Hmm.
that appeared to do nothing. Okay. What the heck? So
Yeah.
hold on. Methodically knocking people's hats off then. It's interesting that I wonder because we have that reset. I wonder if that reset doesn't behave the way we expect.
Yeah, so a good portion of this work is figuring out how is VT100 supposed to work, and then figuring out, are there differences between different terminals? And so some of these bugs will fall into this category of differences between terminals. Now, in the Linux world, there's ncurses, which uses basically a database of all these terminal capabilities to solve this problem across a wide variety of terminals.
Right.
You could imagine this project eventually gaining that kind of a knowledge base. The thing is, there's no equivalent for Windows. Hopefully, we won't need one. And then ncurses as well is not. It doesn't really work great for redirecting output. It's really a VT100 only kind of programming environment. So.
Right. It's meant for pretty output, and there is nothing stopping you. Like if what you're looking for is like pretty windowing type stuff inside of your CLI, there's nothing stopping you from using ncurses rather than the system command line rendering. Like there's some things that I suspect ncurses will still be the better answer for.
Oh yeah,
Like
yeah,
if you're looking to build some sort of Emacs type equivalent with all kinds of fancy, and I in quotes here, GUI bits on your CLI, that it's probably the better answer. It is interesting too. I'll point out. So in this demo, you'll notice that the methodically knocking people's hats off. That sentence is theoretically going darker and darker red according to the RGB values.
yeah.
But you'll notice in your rendering, it only picks one. Whereas over in your PowerShell, you can, or I guess it's going lighter and lighter red, not darker and darker. But regardless, more red as it works its way through. There is on that Wikipedia page that you pulled up, there's a great kind of write-up about the colors that are supported across different terminals, because there's I think a set of like 24 different safe console colors. Like if you look in the, what is it? I think it's System.console color is the built-in class that contains the list of the reduced list of these are the absolutely the
Yeah.
only safe colors you can use. And I believe in our foreground color span, rather than that arbitrary RGB, we actually have static properties for all of the safe colors if you're worried about making sure that you pick a good one. But if you know you're going to be running in terminals where, yeah, so there's your list of all of the safe colors. But
Yep.
obviously that list is very limited, and if you know you're going to be running in terminals that support it, well, you can take advantage and use a wider palette.
Yeah. So I'm gonna put some of this down to just different terminal behaviors.
Right, because I mean we can at least see the difference in the foreground color there. The part that does really interest me is why it seems to be picking up that bold. But yeah, there is whatever terminal is being run. Oh, you've got something else still running.
Something else is holding on to that.
We've got too many terminal windows open. Now everything's bold.
Fascinating.
I am noticing something. The output that from MS Build does appear to also set some formatting. I'm wondering if we might.
New terminal.
Yeah, because you'll notice, like even your command line API on the other terminal went bold as well, which means something left formatting, or something set the flag and then never unset it.
So let's do this then. Let's not go through MS Build every single time we run this thing, right? So we'll go in here, and we'll do a .NET publish. WinX64, is that right?
Oh boy, I always have to look that up.
So this will produce an executable, and then we can just run that directly. We're not going through .NET Run every time.
Right.
Oh, I think I actually do want to be inside of the samples directory. I'm not trying to publish the whole project.
Oh, sorry, Xavier. I think my Nightbot setup might be a little restrictive. Yeah, so Xavier has a great link in the chat as well about testing testing VT100.
Nice.
And the compatibility, or more accurately, the lack thereof.
Yep.
Yeah, this is an excellent one. And I think you mentioned it earlier there as well, how Ncurses goes through and handles it, because despite there being these nice posted standards, there's a constant problem across various terminals with varying levels of support. There's unfortunately not a good standardized way of handling it yet, but we're getting better.
So now we can do this directly against the executable. So we know MS Build is not in the picture. Well, actually, let's even go start a new terminal. Oops.
Good news, you have no viruses.
Okay. Now I've removed the bold. Now let's put the bold back. We'll start yet another terminal so we don't pollute that one. So we'll do our publish again here. And then in this terminal, we'll run our program again. Hard to tell. Try it from here. Ah.
Hold up. Yeah, I was gonna say, right before you ran that, your publish seemed to go bold already.
Interesting. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, it does feel like whatever terminal is inside of VS Code might be
Yeah. Yep.
lying to us.
Well, anyway.
Yeah, so that's a great example of having to run through some of this stuff just to get very lost and confused, and to have issues being terminal related and not necessarily um, console related. Let's go through, John, real quick. I think we have a sample in here that does like the grid or the table layout. Yeah, there's like a top equivalent. Yeah, fire that one off if you don't mind. Because that one's probably worthwhile taking a look at. We might have
Sure.
to
So
make some
another
little.
thing we can do here, now that we actually published this thing, you can't do this from .NET Run. No, can't do it from here either. Nope. Interesting. Let's see. Let's try. Completions are not working for me. Fascinating. Okay, so that's the scrolling output. Let's go back and enable VT. Oops. You will never get a parse error from specifying a directive that doesn't actually exist. Did I do that right? Yeah, it's enable -VT. So we also want to set the output to ANSI. It's not auto-detecting correctly. It'd be nice if this filtered down to the, if this sorted them in some way, according to which had the highest CPU.
That would be nice. Have it bounce around a little bit. I just think that's, yeah. So basically, this guy's just grabbing. Forget how it picks the processes, but it grabs the top X number and then goes through, and you can see it outputting. The one thing that would be nice for it to do is also deal with that, because you see the blinking cursor every time it's effectively going and repainting the screen on an update.
Yep.
Because it has to move the cursor around, redraw those areas. There are ANSI codes for hiding the cursor, and I think one really nice improvement would be turn the cursor off, do the redraw, turn it back on if it was on previously.
Yeah, yep. That's something we could probably do.
Yeah. Let's take a crack at it. Why not?
All right. Let's see. So this is the code here. I feel like we also want to do underline. So this is Anyway, so where do we go here? We want to go into the screen view.
This is you're testing my memory. It's been so long since I wrote this.
Or one of these visitors. I bet it's probably the ANSI visitor, right?
Well, so let's start at the screen view, because I think that was a good place to start, because that's ultimately what's triggering. So these views, they end up working very similar to the way like a Windows form or a WPF kind of rendering stack works, in that when content changes, there's an invalidation notification that propagates its way up through the view hierarchy until it reaches a point where it knows the size that it needs to deal with. And usually, in most cases, it propagates just all the way up to the screen view. So you'll notice that that updated event down there, I believe. So jump to the child updated method. Yeah, and so this goes through, and so the same exact problem that you run into on GUI applications, where you can only have a single thread mucking with your UI elements at a time. This effectively does the same thing, where it uses the context to switch back to the UI thread. It'll batch up if it gets a bunch of these updates that come through at once, so that it only posts a single render pass, and then it calls render, and works its way going back down the UI stack, relaying out the views. So I guess the question comes in where we want to go about doing this. So, because go ahead and jump to like that child render method. That's probably the closest. So line 68.
Yep.
Okay, there. Yeah, and this is where it's going to get interesting because I don't know if we necessarily have a consistent area. Well, go ahead and jump into like content view. Because we could theoretically, I just wonder if we're going to get the blinking. Like in that render to region, we could theoretically wrap that, turning the cursor on and off.
Yep.
Because here we have all the information that we need as far as output mode, ANSI, etc., etc. So we could do it here. I just worry that if we do it here, we're effectively turning it on and off at each of the content views. And so
Right.
like in that process view there's a content view for each one of those effectively cells in that table.
Yeah.
So
I feel like the visitor might be a place where we can control this as well. So this is where we set the cursor to a specific position first. And I think there's a stop operation on it.
Gotcha. So basically hide it before the set position and then re-enable it after we're done?
Maybe, yeah. Although that would probably enable it. Yeah, that still doesn't actually capture the complete render operation from start to finish.
But that's actually fine though. Like if we hide it before we move it. Well, but if we re-enable it after the write, because it won't be back to its original position yet, I suspect we'll still see the flashing at the end of the content views. So we won't necessarily see the cursor jump to the beginning, but we might see it at the very end.
We could try it.
Let's do it.
So because this is just a text output stream, right? We're just writing text out. So this is what the API looks like. And all these cursor things, right? Cursor hide. So you'll see here, right, the writer, it wants a string. Cursor hide is an ANSI control code. The thing that's interesting about ANSI control codes is that if you toString them, I believe they're just empty. And that is one of the things that enables you to embed them inside of an interpolated string and render that string out. And they're hidden, right? You actually need the right renderer to, like what Kevin was saying before, is like tear them apart, find the control code objects that were passed into the interpolated string, and render them on condition of whether you actually want to render them. Okay, so that just broke a whole bunch of tests, but that's okay. The real question is, if we do that, and I think I will go back to .NET running this thing.
Yep.
It's usually a good idea to clean up the publish folder. Do this.
What happens if you don't clean up the publish folder?
You get a build error.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, strange trivia. Anyway. So what was that command? We want this, right? But we're going back to .NET Run mode so we can make changes to the code and not have to publish each time. Okay, so the cursor, is the resolution, the frame resolution coming through okay? This looks okay. Like this, it's still blinking, but I don't see it jumping around as much.
I'm seeing it at different places, but it is the places where I'll see it flash. Well, no, there was a couple at the beginning.
No, it didn't solve the problem. Interesting.
Because we really don't have we don't necessarily have a good concept of where we are in the rendering of this.
Yeah.
And
The console. Should we
grumble,
try
grumble,
it at
grumble.
screen view level?
Yeah, I mean we can go to the screen view level. That'll work. It has the knowledge, I guess, because you could wrap that render call.
Yeah, and we could just do it right here, right? This is the whole. Is this the whole operation, or it's this one
Yep.
here?
No, you want to do it up on the 68.
Okay.
And this is where it gets interesting. Because you have to do the render to region.
Yeah, so we could do it this way.
Format or parse to span.
This returns a span, right? And we can render that to a.
Yeah.
Can we just go straight to the writer? Do we have a writer here? So inside of the console renderer, there's the
There's a
iConsole.
console. I don't think it's exposed anywhere, though. I mean, you could do render to region.
Yeah, but this also does a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, that does do a bunch of stuff.
I kind of want to. I think the cleanest thing we can do, just as an experiment, right, is just render it straight to the console. We could, I mean, as an experiment right now, we can certainly just expose the console here because we do have it.
That is true.
So let's just do that.
And maybe just as an API thought, it does seem that there's kind of this, like I realize ANSI 100 does it with control code outputs, but perhaps we don't necessarily expose it the same way.
Yeah.
Because it feels like if I wanted to code against this, what I really want to do is have something where, hide cursor, show cursor. Or better yet, something that gives me an iDisposable that I can act on.
Yeah. Yep. So here, so now we just back to string value, right? So we can just go grab the cursor hide.
Yep.
Directly, and write out its escape sequence. See what that gives us.
Let's re-enable it at the end.
Okay.
Just hypothetical. Because I would still expect to see a flash if we re-enable it, but I would expect the flash to remain in that bottom right-hand corner. Because it is worth noting that when you use the screen view, it does effectively clear the screen.
Yep.
Hey. Booyah.
That's looking better. It's also showing that we didn't break any tests, which means that we don't have tests for the screen view, I'm guessing.
Hey. You're so picky. There are technically tests for the screen view, but they clearly are not that specific.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an area where if we don't know what's the right behavior, a lot of times with the rendering stuff, you kind of have to experiment, figure out what gives you the right effect, and then encode that into a test to pin the behavior in place.
Right.
So it's fair that we don't have tests here because we're just figuring out what's the right way to do this.
Right. Well, and I think the tests that are on there are more about, does it call child render with the right stuff? I don't think it's actually testing any sort of output. because
Yeah.
I don't think the unit tests that go through screen view actually get all the way down to doing any sort of rendering. I think it's more or less just pinning the interaction between the objects.
So now I moved the restoring of the cursor to the disposal of the screen view. So now it's hidden for the entire life of the screen view. Since the screen view takes over the screen, maybe there's no point in ever showing a cursor until we kill the screen view.
So I kind of agree with that, but that only makes because it only makes sense if the screen view is going to be doing updating, and the screen view doesn't know if it's doing updating until a child view raises that update event. Because it could be that somebody uses a screen view to just lay it out, and then they expect the user to type something in.
Yeah, but we don't have an input mode right now. But yeah, assuming that that's sort of a different thing, is coordinating the screen view based on input. But right now, what the screen view does is it really renders a non-interactive view.
That is true.
Interactivity is a bit more complex, and we kind of left it out of scope for the moment.
Right.
Because we figured, before you can have interactivity, you've got to have a good rendering experience in any case.
That is true.
But I think that's a fair thing. Is like this definitely won't work for interactive mode. And also my cursor. Oh, there's my cursor. Okay. I thought it was gone forever.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to go through it, okay, so I think that's probably a fair assertion to have it hide the cursor for now.
Yep.
I think that then the question becomes, how should the screen view get access to that console? Because exposing it via the renderer is not the right answer.
Well, we could also pass it in directly. If the screen view needs access to the console, it should just have a console.
True. It's probably simpler.
Yeah, let's do that.
This will break tests.
This will break compilation first.
Yeah.
I think in every single case, we're going to have a console near at hand. I hope. Yep. There's a test terminal, which we can test terminal. So test terminal implements iConsole, because terminal implements iConsole.
Yep.
So we should just be able to do this. Why was... Is there a second... What am I missing?
Hey, John, are the fans on your computer firing up right now by any chance?
Oh, yeah.
That's the back feeding noise that I'm getting on your mic. See, there are tests on screen view.
The thing that I often like to bring up here. Let's see. So where are we? Guys. Oh, see these build errors? That's because of the publish thing before. I think I need to clear out the. Let's see. Oops. Oh, fun.
Well, this one's pretty simple. It's just invocation context.console.
Yep. So the invocation context was passed into the dragon fruit entry point here because we asked for it to be. And so that's kind of the, system.console, system.command line types are available.
Yeah.
In your command handlers.
That was one thing that I ran into at work the other day is we don't have a good list of what all the magical types are that you can ask for in your command handler. Outside of the unit test, that was the closest place where I could find a reasonable list.
Yep. Yeah, I kind of started that a little bit with the interactive tutorial that I pushed the other day.
That's true. I did not look there.
But it's not a good reference material, it's more of a tutorial.
Right. I was thinking somewhere where we list out like the dragon fruit command handlers or something.
Right.
Just a call out of, hey, by the way, here's the extra magical parameter types you can ask for and we'll pass them in.
Oh, I see. I've got to go all the way to the root here. And this build error is the one that's because I published it. Okay. You won't always see this. It's because of the .NET Core implicit app version. The implicit SDK version gets locked in place when you publish. What is still bugging? And .NET Clean apparently does not wipe it out. Oh, this is aggressive. When in doubt, and the reason I'm starting System Command Line solution from the terminal, again, is because of that PowerShell environment variable.
So that you can make sure that you pick it up inside of the session. Got it. Cool.
Everything should work fine. Like if you don't disable Arcade, everything will work fine. Certain tooling might be broken. The specific tooling in this case that it will interfere with is Ncrunch. Ncrunch does not, Arcade redirects all of the build outputs into an artifacts folder, and Ncrunch does not seem to know how to follow it over there. So if you like your build outputs to be in the normal bin and obj folders underneath each project, disable Arcade. Now, this will build. The other thing that happened, of course, is that Ncrunch is now disabled because I wiped out the Ncrunch files when I did the git clean, so I don't re-enable this. But the build looks good.
Yay.
We could talk about benchmarks sometime.
Oh, that's right. We did get those added, didn't we?
Yeah. And I don't think Ncrunch loves the benchmark projects very much.
That is.
I'm just disabling the benchmarks.
Got it.
Yeah, so these are the little tips and tricks.
Did you, maybe I missed it, did you stash the current work before you did the clean, or did you just clean what FDX?
There were no added files, so.
Got it.
But always run git status before running git clean.
Yes. I've got a couple projects where we've got like developer config files that aren't checked in, and yeah, git clean always wipes them out. And so I've learned I just need to keep a backup copy sitting off outside the repo.
Yeah. I actually did recover a bunch of stuff that I wiped out using git clean recently. There are cases in which you can recover stuff that was wiped out with git clean.
Really?
Yep.
From what? Just like a file deletion utility, or?
No, if you ever committed them at all, then you can find references to them in your GitHub repository, in your Git repository.
Got it, and extract them that way.
It's a pain in the butt. You basically have to go and
hunt through history for find files based on path.
Cool.
Ugh.
Yeah, it just gives you like a list of GUIDs, and then you have to ask it for each one of those GUIDs to show what the diffs are, and then you need to extract the diffs out and manually apply them back to your files. But sometimes that's quicker than rewriting everything that you just blew away because you were being stupid.
That's true. And more importantly, demo works.
Yep.
Cool. Did we break any tests doing this?
No.
That's a problem.
Well, we're just not. We clearly don't have any tests that are checking that like outermost render operation in the screen view.
Right. Should we write some tests before we do something crazy like commit this?
Yeah. Where did this test? So we've got screen view test.
Yeah, there are some tests here. I mean, the first thing I'm seeing right out the gate, do we care to write the quick one real quick? On the null reference on the structure parameter. So, I mean, you can basically duplicate that same test right there.
What do you want to test?
Screen view requires a console. Yep, and okay, and if I'm being really pedantic, rather than the camel casing on your screen view, we might want to match the other naming where the moron who wrote them the first time put an underscore between them.
Oh, dear.
We won't mention his name.
We could probably find it out. Want to find it out?
This is the part where we need to rewrite. Git history. Oh, so something you should show off real quick, John, because I mentioned this to a coworker, and I want to show this to them. Your fancy edit in VS Code command. Do you mind showing that? Because I believe that's just open an external tool with the correct parameters.
Yeah, so what I just did, because I like to use the multiple cursors functionality in Visual Studio Code because it's awesome, and various other things. Sometimes it's just you want to have a text editor that's not quite as opinionated about the thing you're editing. Mm-hmm. I have this keystroke that I set up, so it's a tool. If you go into, so what it does, I'll show the tool entry here. It's just under External Tools, VS Code. So it's just a path to the VS Code actually, and then this little thing here that tells it what to arguments to pass to VS Code, which is pulling from your current cursor position, current file. So the idea is that I can, if I want to say, I want to edit this thing right here in VS Code, right, I'll just hit Alt-Shift-V, and now I'm in Visual Studio Code in that same position. And now I can do stuff like move lines around, or maybe I want to, I want to have multiple cursors because I want to do something strange, what it might be, right?
Yeah.
That's the idea.
And then you save it here, and as the other setting that's key to turn on in Visual Studio is the automatic reloading of your files when they change from external source. So that way when you hit save in VS Code, Visual Studio reloads it. So, cool. Okay, so that test passes. Let's do another test then. We should probably, what did I call it? Probably render hides cursor, or something to that effect. That'll work.
Okay.
So let's go up and new up a new screen view. Can you go back down? I'm wondering if, scroll down your left view to the screen view where we actually did the work. Because so we should probably do two tests. This one where render hides the cursor, and then one more where dispose shows it. Cool. Okay.
What do you want to say? Unhides the cursor?
No, I like show. It matches the ANSI command.
Yeah.
The other thing that is clearly missing from this is this code is clearly making massive assumptions about the output, because we're just randomly spewing ANSI characters out, which is almost assuredly not what you want. Like these two right lines, we clearly need more checks around them for output modes and that sort of thing.
Right.
But that will be a different test. So let's do screen gets new screen view. You can basically do the same type of instantiation as what's on 62. So it'll take, all that jazz. And the thing is, we don't actually need a view.
Oh.
Because we've got the no prop operator on child right there, and I know I saw another test about if there's no child, it doesn't error. It's just no ops basically.
Okay.
So, which does beg the question: should we be writing out this ANSI escape character if there is no child? But that's a different discussion. So screen render.
I would say should it. What's the scenario for not having a child?
Programmer hasn't set one up yet. It seems it's potentially programmer error, because I don't know how else you get into this situation where the child is unset. And so, I mean, we can even just leave it at that and be done. Screen.render, because that'll. I mean, do we call into the overload directly? That feels a little bit more like. The basic overload is probably fine, because we've got another test that asserts that if you go into the parameterless overload, it calls the other one.
Okay.
So that seems reasonable. And so then we need to do, should start with.
Might be a little aggressive, but that's probably correct right now, right?
For now, it is correct. Hide escape sequence.
Oh. Good call. I was moving on to the next test already. Okay.
Cool.
That's cool.
Sweet.
So here's my.
Very nice.
Okay. So next one, I guess, is similar to this, right?
Yep. So we can pretty much, well, so
But we
here's
need
the
to
thing.
dispose it.
We technically don't even need to call render.
Huh, okay.
We can just do screen.dispose.
Nice.
And I would say ends with, not starts with, and then you need to change your escape sequence. Oh, no, you're right. Yep. Cool. And that's roughly what I would expect.
Yep.
So here's the only thing that's kind of bothering me a little bit about this, and maybe we do need to expose something via the renderer. Because right now the renderer has all of that logic in render to region for
Yep.
handling the various output modes
Mm-hmm.
and determining whether it should display ANSI characters or not.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if renderer needs another overload to support this kind of thing. Because ideally, rather than having the console to act on right here, I think what would be cleaner is if in screen view we could just do renderer dot render control code or
Yeah, we even talked about doing that via the terminal itself, that maybe we want different implementations of terminal for ANSI versus non-ANSI terminals.
right, because this kind of raw writing out of these things, we either have to duplicate all the logic for our modes to know whether it's okay to write these things out.
Yep.
I mean, I guess it really is only an if check, isn't it?
Well, but right now we already have that responsibility by, because we've got the different visitor classes.
Mm-hmm.
So we
Right.
have we have the ANSI rendering span visitor, the file rendering span visitor, I think, and then the non-ANSI span rendering visitor, content rendering span visitor. Yeah, it's the different ones that implement this.
Right.
So it's these three,
Let's take it. Can
right?
we?
And these are the ones where, right now, that decision about how to render is made.
Right. Well, but the decision about which one of these visitors gets used is handled in the renderer. Let's jump to that. Let's jump to console renderer, render to region. There's a switch statement in there, if my memory is correct. So
Yeah.
yeah, so on that mode of what it does, because that's that auto detect that you were mentioning on line 71, where if the mode is set to auto, which I believe is the default, it falls
Yep.
back and says, okay, try to detect, otherwise, we're just going to go conservative and go plain text. And then it shells out to the various visitors.
Output mode is plain text. I've been calling it file on the command line.
Maybe
Okay.
that's the problem. I'm surprised that doesn't give you, for the parameters on directives, shouldn't that be a parse error?
Yeah, that one probably should, if the directive is opinionated about what values can be in there. Directives are kind of a special world right now, because we don't have the notion of discovering what directives are available.
Right.
And so what we do is we just say, if you pass in directives, we we can act on them, right? But we won't validate them.
Right.
Kind of like HTTP headers.
Right.
Well,
And
yeah.
I can understand that and being very loose on the directives themselves, but once somebody has specified a directive name,
Yep.
like output mode, it feels like the directive itself could be very opinionated about what values it would allow and error. So if you fat finger your output mode from auto to be ATO,
Yep.
it probably should blow up in your face to say,
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
yeah, at least for the directive parameters. I understand being a little bit more loose on the directives themselves. Anyway, so my thought though is we've already got sort of this switch of what we're going to render out.
Yep.
And these visitors, because I am wondering if we could take advantage of this render to region. Because what exactly does it use the region for anyway? Because in our case, we really could give it a 0 region for turning the cursor on and off.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't need to be a region, really, right? It's just
Yeah.
render it now. It's
Yeah, and I'm
it is
almost.
just a text stream.
Yeah, exactly. Because we allow the span itself to be null, but we don't allow the region. I'm wondering if we just lax that restriction.
Or maybe it's just a separate method. Render to region feels
Oh
a
yeah,
diff-
like it really should be.
but we can factor this into two different methods where one doesn't take a region. Does the span visitor will the span visitor tolerate non-binary region?
Not currently.
It's tricky because when you're in ANSI mode, you really do want the render operation to be region specific because it also needs to clean up that region.
True. But that's also why I'm wondering if maybe we just give it like a 0 sized region.
Hmm.
Like it would be nice if there was a nice easy because we've got the screen view builds a region that represents the whole screen by basically looking at the console size. I almost want to get one that's similar that's basically region dot zero where it looks at the current cursor position for its XY position, but then
Yep.
sets height width to either 1 or 0. I don't know if it'd be tolerant of 0. I feel like that's an off by 1 error waiting to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like I wouldn't want to expose that implementation detail in the API.
No, I agree with that. But I'm just thinking for the if we had a second one of these methods that didn't take a region, that's how we could get around the visitors requiring a region.
Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe the visitors should not require a region.
Hmm. I mean, that is a possibility.
I mean,
The
another
the
way of thinking about it, I guess, if you have is that we're not really rendering a text span anymore, right? Or it's not a content span, maybe, right? It's just, what are the different span types we have? I think this render without a region maybe should only be used for rendering control signals,
Agreed.
which
Definitely.
means it's a very different kind of overload than what we have right now for render to region.
Right. So maybe
It's
rather
maybe take something less general than a span.
I could see that. Though we don't currently have anything to separate out those control codes.
Well, maybe it just takes maybe it just takes an ANSI escape sequence directly, or an ANSI code or whatever the type was.
Mm.
All right, so maybe rendering an ANSI control code. Maybe it's render ANSI control code, no region.
I could see that. Because the control codes, I can't say don't take up any space. Because there's ones in there that are like clear screen, which clearly take up the whole screen's worth of space.
Yeah, yeah,
But I think that overload is still clear in that it's no longer just rendering content. It's actually saying no, go perform this action, and it's up to you to do it. Kind of
yeah.
like
It's a little bit interesting because actually, what we actually want, everything that you're saying makes perfect sense. I want to revise what I said though. Is it's not an ANSI escape sequence. It's some other thing that can be generalized across ANSI and non-ANSI terminals.
oh, so you not necessarily a ANSI control code is the overload, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
I guess what would you propose that argument to be, though?
It's kind of like these right here. Oh, wait, is this why the bold thing wasn't working correctly? No. Style span. Right, so we have these here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And this was the thing that we started looking at the beginning, which is, this is a generalization across, it's an abstraction that lets us do formatting stuff independent of the type of terminal.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the ANSI rendering span visitor maps them to ANSI codes.
Right.
Right, this is a mapping of those spans to specific ANSI codes.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we look at the non-ANSI one, it does something rather different. It maps them to console colors, for example. And it maps them to, foreground color mappings, background color mappings. Right, so when it visits a color span, it says, oh, I've got this color span, what should I do? It gets the mapping out, and then it sets the background color.
Yep.
Or the foreground color. Whereas this one here just can be a lot simpler. It just writes out the escape sequence. I guess we should look at the background color span, compare apples to apples. So we could do something similar for this, for cursor control and screen clearing and things like that. And then we just add another method to the visitor and have the two different implementations of it.
Are you proposing something that ultimately derives from span?
Yep. So the ANSI class, right, we noticed this before, we've got all these different categories in here. So we've got the color category. The cursor category is not represented by spans right now. I mean, you can use them inside of other spans. But like scroll, cursor, hide, show, save position, all this stuff here inside of cursor. We don't have a dedicated span class the way that we do for the foreground and background color spans and style spans. Mm-hmm. Right? But we could have a cursor control span, I guess, right? It's a little bit weird for the System.console stuff, but I guess it works. Right? And then that thing, each of the visitors can act accordingly to translate that into something that works for the specific terminal that it's working with.
And what would you put as data on that span? I guess it would have to be an ANSI control code, wouldn't it? No? Or would you actually effectively duplicate this data so that you don't necessarily expose?
I mean, that's what we did for the style spans, for example, right?
That is true.
And we did it in a compiler-safe way by using name of.
True.
And we act upon them by name. We index them by name. So it's a glorified string. It's a string, but with some compiler, differentiated by type. So the compiler can help us out. But the thing that matters about it at the bottom of it is the string.
Got it. So we end up with a cursor span with a bunch of statics on it for, move position or show, hide, etc.
Yeah. Yep.
It's not a bad idea.
I think we had considered that these things could also they could just as easily be methods. But the thing is that, if they're methods, then you'd imagine a class that grows over time, whereas this is a little bit easier to come in and say, you know what, I would actually like to implement this obscure additional escape code. Mm-hmm. Right, so this kind of lets people bring in additional functionality without having to go and extend classes or whatever.
Right.
But this is very kind of close to the metal.
That is true. Okay, Well, I think we have two options. We go and implement it now, or we document it for later.
I think I would vote for the document it for later part. I don't know how long you wanted to spend on this tonight, but I think.
Well, probably not too much longer. We're getting close to that 2 hour mark, and I unfortunately have to get up for the my son's hospital stay tomorrow. So
Yeah, yep, that's the way it works. I've got it. Yeah, I've got a day tomorrow as well. So we can open an issue for it.
yeah, let's document this then real quick, and we'll go through and have it for later. Maybe we'll get lucky. Somebody on the stream wants to go and pick this up and get it knocked out tonight. You could have a pull request by morning.
Hey, nice. Okay. So let's open an issue here. I want to put the rendering label on it.
Mm-hmm.
You can put help wanted. Who knows if it's a good first issue? Sure.
Depends on how much of the stream the person's been watching.
Yeah. Good first issue though. The convention in across the .NET open source projects is that when I put for me as a contributor on the project, if I put good first issue on something, I've basically signed myself up to help somebody move a PR to completion on that issue. Mm-hmm. So I'm I can provide help. I'll provide code reviews, etc.
So for anybody watching this, keep that in mind if you want to contribute to this. Hunting through all of the issues labeled with good first issue, especially if John's put it on there, you can see that he's clearly a helpful individual who's good at this.
It's kind of a hard one to explain.
Yeah. Well, I think so. I think for a first cut, and I don't necessarily, I wouldn't expect somebody to go through and implement it, but I would expect the spans to be there, and then the corresponding visitor methods to be created. And, and obviously corresponding unit tests, because those visitors, I believe, are fairly well tested.
Yep. Let's see.
Cool. So while you're typing that, I'll just go back through and make sure that I'm clear on exactly what we said we were going to do. Is we'll have effectively a cursor span class that mimics what we have for the, was it format span, I think, that had the various blink, bold, etc. methods on there.
Yep.
Not format span, style span, I think. And then on each of the visitors, they should watch for this given span type. And the ANSI visitor should obviously convert it into the corresponding ANSI control codes or escape sequences.
Yep.
The non-ANSI visitor should convert it into system console calls, because at least the cursor positioning stuff System.console does support. And then for the for the plain text visitor, I think it's just straight up ignore them.
Yeah, that's almost always the case. The plain text visitor is...
It ignores everything but content, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
So that one's simple. Don't add a method to it.
Yeah.
Because I think the base visitor implementation is just empty for everything.
So this is, what is this one called? The non-ANSI rendering span visitor.
This is one thing that I would love GitHub implemented, is some way to effectively link stuff in your comments to, at least with like or autocomplete, to link to files in your repo.
Yeah.
Which would be awesome. Especially if it was smart enough, if the file got renamed or whatever, to update the comment on the issue so that it could follow it around. I'll keep wishing. Maybe someday I'll get it.
File rendering span visitor. Maybe that's not the best name for this thing.
Yeah, because I think that output mode used to be called file at one point, and then it got renamed down to plain text. And
Yep.
I think the span visitor just got left behind in the refactor.
Yeah, I think so. This is more of a parenthetical. Cool. Something like that.
Sweet. Cool. So if anybody is interested in picking up an issue and working on rendering stuff, here's a good one.
Yeah. If you want to add a link to this recording when it's available into this, it'll provide more context than anyone could possibly need.
That is true. Once I get it, I usually export them to YouTube, and so I'll try and be convenient and also pass in the timestamp for it so that somebody doesn't have to scroll through 2 hours of video to figure out where the useful bits start.
Yeah, yeah. Cool.
Sweet. Well, anything else you wanted to look at, or any closing thoughts?
No, not really. I mean, this was good.
Yeah.
Very kind of make it up as we go. So I didn't really have an agenda, so I don't really have closing thoughts.
Perfect. And I was relying on you for the agenda, so that means I don't have much of one either. So unless anyone on chat has any final questions or thoughts, we'll probably wrap it up here. But thank you, John, once again for coming on. This is always fun. I enjoy pairing with you, especially going through this project. It's been exciting and fun to work on. So
Yeah, likewise. It's been great.
We'll have to do it more.
And this is the flashy part for people who want to get involved. You know, it's almost like UI.
For those of us who like our WPF, it does feel a little more friendly.
Yeah.
Though it's WPF where you have to deal with VT100. So it's a weird blend. So cool.
Yeah. It's the technology of future past.
Exactly. Awesome. And thank you, Xavier, for hanging out. We appreciate it. We will probably end up doing more of these. I'm sure at some point, John, I'll be pinging you for schedule and steal more of your time to do this stuff on the live stream. It seems like this is fairly useful. If nothing else, it gets me a little more involved on the project. So I miss our weekly stand-ups on it at times. So.
Oh yeah, no, I think this is a good format for it.
Yeah. Works well. Well, with that, I am going to kill the stream, and I will get some stuff uploading. Thanks, guys, for hanging out.
Great. Thanks a lot. Good night.